Good evening, everyone. I can see we've got a total of 12 people on the call at the moment. I'm just going to hold for a few minutes in case one or two folk are still just swallowing down their last bit of potato or whatever before they join us. So just hold for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, very good evening, everybody. It's a couple of minutes past 7, so and I'm a great believer in starting things on time. There may be one or two people still to join us, but let's get going. So my name is Andrew Thinn, Chairman of the Scottish Land Commission. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I'll explain a bit more about that, why we're here, what we're doing in a minute. But first of all, I just want to make some introductions. So I've explained myself, but just a wee bit more about myself. So I've chaired the Scottish Land Commission since it was set up 5 years ago, and have also over the years chaired a number of other public bodies. I also at the moment work in Scotland's prisons a fair bit of the time, and I run a small charitable foundation. And the other people, Megan, can I pass to you to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. I'm one of the appointed land commissioners. I'm joining you from my home in Applecross over on the Northwest Highlands, where I'm part of a crofting family, and I'm also a local development manager for the Applecross Community Company, which is the local development trust. And it's really great to be able to join you and hear more about what's happening on Shetland. Cheers.
Brilliant, thanks, Megan. And Emma is the other person you can probably see on your screens. Emma, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, good evening. I'm Emma Cooper and I'm employed by the Scottish Land Commission as the head of land rights and responsibilities. So my job is to work with landowners and to work with policymakers to embed the Scottish Government's land rights and responsibility statement in practice and policy, which you'll hear a bit about later on or shortly. I'm over in Inverness and I've managed land before as a community forest, and I've also worked on a number of different rural issues and so on. And I've been with the Commission for a couple of years now.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. So you've got 2 board members, 1 senior member of staff. Also, but you can't see them, we've got two other people, Jess and Posey, who are making all the technology work and keeping us all out of trouble. And if you follow the chat function, you'll see that as we proceed through this, when we're discussing, for example, community ownership, they will pop up various links in the chat function so that you can, at your leisure in due course, find out more about whatever it is we're talking about. Just a few words from me. First of all, about why did we do this? So since we started, the Land Commission was created 5 years ago. Since we started, we have pretty much every month, and before the pandemic, we did this in person. We've held a public meeting somewhere in Scotland, and we've held public meetings over the 5 years all over Scotland. Since the pandemic, there was a gap at the beginning of the pandemic while we figured out what to do, because we couldn't, clearly we couldn't be holding public meetings in village halls. So we experimented with this online format and found that it actually works pretty well. And importantly, it allows people to attend public meetings who otherwise would not be able to, for whatever reason, because their family circumstances or because they live a long way from wherever the village hall is or whatever. So we're now continuing, at least for the moment, using with this online public meeting format. We may in due course go to a mixture of both, because some people simply prefer to eyeball you in a village hall. And I have to say also, some people prefer to talk privately in the margins of a village hall. That's more difficult. They're not impossible online. So that's what we're doing. The format is pretty much the same whether in a village hall or not. The point of this exercise is to have a discussion with you, a conversation with you. It's not to give you a lecture or anything else. And these meetings inform what we do. The Land Commission was set up by Parliament in 2017, and it was instructed, in essence, to develop and provide advice for government and for Parliament and for the public, landowners and all the rest of it, on issues relating to land and land reform. Now that's a huge, potentially a huge remit, and we're a tiny wee body. We've got, I think, about a dozen staff. So we had to, from the very beginning, be absolutely clear that we would ruthlessly prioritize what we did and what we didn't do. And in order to figure out what priorities should be, we use these public meetings. And so, of course, at the beginning, the public meetings were hugely instrumental in the first 3-year plan. And that continues to be the case. We're now on our second 3-year plan. And later this year, towards the end of this year, we'll start to develop our third 3-year plan. So conversations that we have in these public meetings now will shape the third strategic plan and will shape the priorities that we focus on in that plan. So they are enormously important. What we're going to do is Megan is going to skate you through a quick sort of overview of what we'll do at the moment, what we're trying to do at the moment. And that will take, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, something like that. And then we want to have a conversation with you. And in order to do that, there are two options, essentially. There's a button on your screen. And if you look at the bottom or the side or wherever, you'll see a button that says raise hand. Now you can click on that if you want to speak, and I'll bring you in. And it'd be good to hear from you, because I mean, I think it's always good to hear, real human voices. But there is also an option which says chat, and it's got a wee bubble above it, which allows you simply, if you click on that, it allows you to type your thoughts into a box, and then everyone can see it that way. So if you're a bit shy, use that one. And both work actually pretty well. And what, if you type something into the chat, I will try and make sure that then the discussion picks that up as best I can. If hundreds of things stream through the chat, I'll get in a guddle, but it doesn't usually happen. I usually manage to stay vaguely in control. And I expect the conversation to last, I don't know, maybe till 8 o'clock, maybe till 8:30, I don't know. I'll give you a commitment now that we'll finish no later than 8:30. That's what we said in advertising the meeting, and that will allow you to be away certainly no later than 8:30. So I think that's probably enough from me, really. I think it'd be good now to hear from Megan, and she'll just give you an overview of what we're all about, a scene setting thing, if you like, and then it'll be open forum. It's entirely up to you after that, but over to Megan just now. Megan.
Cheers, Andrew. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so, if I can get these slides to work, just giving you guys a brief overview of who the Land Commission are and what it is we are up to. So we have been tasked with driving forward land reform, but well, what does that mean and why does it matter anyway? I like to start talking about why it matters based on some real life examples. And often when we think about land reform, we think about these really iconic community buyouts. The Isle of Egg, which just celebrated 25 years of community ownership last weekend, or the more recent community acquisition of 5,000 hectares of Langham Moor from the Buccleuch estate down in the Borders. And these are really good examples of land reform, but land reform is also so much more than this. It's the community acquisition of St Ninian's Church in Bigton, which I think finally went through in February this year. I'm sure you're going to correct me if that's wrong. Land reform is also about dealing with sites like this on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a car park that's been empty in this very centre of Forres for nearly 20 years. And land reform is also, of course, about supporting successful crofting and agricultural communities. And it's because of all these reasons that the Land Commission really believe that land reform continues to be really important and urgent for all of Scotland. And it's really important that we carry on thinking about what needs to change in terms of how we own, use and manage land in order for our land to be really giving us what we need it to be doing for the future. Because land reform is about making sure that vacant and derelict sites like this old Tesco site in Forres stop being a blight on the community and start becoming a piece of land which is used productively, whether it's for social or economic or environmental reasons. Land reform is about making sure that families have access to good quality, affordable homes in the places they want to live in. It's about making sure that communities are able to get engaged and involved in decisions about land that are going to impact on them rather than being excluded from that. And it's also about making sure that farming and crofting communities are successful and resilient. So at the Land Commission, we really see land reform as a key part of the creation of places across Scotland that people want to live and work in. And we also see it as a key part of the sort of broader policy response to the big challenges we face at the moment: the economic recovery after the pandemic, dealing with our affordable housing crisis, protecting human rights, regenerating town centres, and responding to the climate challenges and the biodiversity crisis. And it's for all of these reasons why we feel so passionately about the importance of land reform, and also what we are trying to do to push this all forward. So, as Andrew said, the Scottish Land Commission was established by Parliament in 2017. It's one of the outcomes of the 2016 Land Reform Act. We are 5 land commissioners. You have 2 of us joining you tonight, me and Andrew, and 1 tenant farming commissioner, and I'll talk about his role later on in the presentation. And then we're supported by a great team of staff who are based out of our office in Inverness. So our role is to provide advice to the Scottish Government and other stakeholders about a programme of land reform which is relevant for urban and rural areas. We provide advice and recommendations for what needs to change in terms of the legislative framework and policies, but also, and equally importantly, what needs to change on the ground in terms of helping to improve and push land reform forward at a very local level. So before I get into the detail of our activities, I wanted to speak just for a minute about a key Scottish Government policy which really underpins all of our work and also has set the direction for land reform. And this is the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. And this is another of the outcomes from the 2016 Land Reform Act. This policy is unique actually in the world in terms of clearly articulating the relationship between land reform and human rights, recognising that along with rights to land come responsibilities, not just responsibilities to your neighbours and your local communities, but also responsibilities to make sure that the land you're looking after or owning or managing is delivering for the public good, for the public benefit. And through this policy, we are no longer in Scotland thinking about the protection of private property rights as a hindrance to land reform, but actually moving in line with the rest of the world and recognising that if we think about progressing human rights, that can help to support land reform, and that land reform, of course, can also help to meet our human rights obligations. So this Land Rights and Responsibility Statement is a key sort of underpinning of our work and the land reform, the programme of land reform that we are working with the government and other stakeholders to introduce. We're going to see a lot of discussion about the relationship between land reform and human rights in the next few months, because this Parliament has committed to a new land reform bill, and the government is about to start consulting on the draft on what that bill might contain in the next few months. And we also have a new human rights bill coming in the next few months. So this is definitely going to be something which is going to be discussed a lot in the public over the coming months. So what are we actually doing? As Andrew said, we're about halfway through our second 3-year strategic plan, which runs from 2020 to 2023. All of the pieces of work I'm going to talk about now are available on our website. And Posey, who's providing a lot of support behind the scenes, one of our colleagues, is going to be putting up links to various different specific pieces of work as I go through the rest of the presentation. So this strategic plan has 3 different priority areas: reforming land rights, responsible land ownership and use, and reforming land markets. So in terms of reforming land rights, we recognise that the way in which we use and own land has a significant impact on the distribution of wealth, resources, control and power and benefits within our society. So achieving and moving towards wider government objectives such as tackling inequality or responding to the climate emergency or the just transition require us to rethink our system for reforming land rights. And we are doing this in a number of different ways. We are encouraging a more diverse pattern of land ownership. So back in 2018, one of the very first things we did was to undertake and publish some research which looked at the various different barriers and challenges which are preventing communities from taking on ownership of assets and buildings, and that continues to be a key theme within everything we're doing. We've also been identifying new governance models which could widen the range of people who can benefit from land. Here in Scotland, we tend to think about land ownership being either public or private, or by NGOs or by communities, whereas in other parts of Europe, it's actually much more common to have a number of those different entities owning and being responsible for the same piece of land, and there's quite a number of benefits that can come from that. So we've been looking at those models and thinking about how they could be applied here. And we're also going to continue to be working on this question about how do we balance the protection of private property rights, but also progress the other human rights that relate to land, which are known as the economic, social and cultural rights. Another key piece of work within this first work stream has been research and analysis and the work that we've been doing, making recommendations around addressing the impact of Scotland's highly concentrated pattern of land ownership. Back in 2018, the Scottish Government asked us to undertake some research to better understand these impacts, and we published the results of that and recommendations in response to it in the spring of 2019. And those recommendations really focused in on how to manage some very negative impacts that are being caused by monopoly ownership of land, and also the monopoly over the control and decision-making of land. And one of the things we are recommending is the introduction of a test for the public interest for future large-scale land transfers. In this new land reform bill, the Scottish Government has committed to work towards addressing the problems associated with concentrated land ownership, including introducing a public interest test. So we expect there to be more discussion about how that might work in practice over the coming months. The second of our work streams is looking at responsible land ownership and use, and that really focuses on whoever owns a piece of land, making sure that they're doing it in a way which is responsible and accountable to local communities and also to the wider public. And we're doing this through focusing on supporting landowners and local communities in the implementation of that high-level policy I already mentioned, the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And we do this through our Good Practice programme, and it's great to have Emma join us this evening, who's be able to answer all your questions about this area of our work, plus lots of other parts of our work as well. So within the Good Practice programme, we've published 8 protocols and then further tools and guidance to help landowners and local communities think about implementing these priorities, these statements on the ground. We've also begun to work with public bodies, local authorities and the private sector to think about how they could mainstream the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement within their operations. We've also, in the last year, been working quite closely with local authorities who are adopting a community wealth building approach, thinking about what land reform means in support of that. And we recently published some guidance on community wealth building and land reform. And I think Posey's going to be putting links up to that work, hopefully soon in the chat box. And then the third of our work streams is around reforming land markets. One of the things we've been grappling with since we were set up in 2017 was why is it that our land market is not operating effectively and efficiently across the country, and what can be done to address this? And what I mean by this, why is it that in some places like in Applecross where I live, there's a desperate need for land for affordable houses, whereas in other parts of the country we've got large areas of land which have been sitting vacant and derelict for decades. So one of the things we're doing, and one of the first things we did around this area, is trying to tackle the problem of vacant and derelict land. There's more than 11,000 hectares of land across Scotland which is currently vacant and derelict. I think there's 8 sites on the Shetland Islands totaling around 7 hectares of land. And these sites are not just a blight on the households, the local communities who live beside them, but they're also a real missed opportunity in terms of what else you could do with that land and how you could use it more productively. So together with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, we set up the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which brought national attention to this issue, convened a whole series of different stakeholder events and workshops, and made a series of recommendations, which have now been taken forward by the government, local authorities and other agencies to try and really make better use of these vacant and derelict sites. Another piece of work which we finished at the end of last year was a 2-year study looking at the way in which land is being made available for housing and development. We particularly looked at the way in which land is coming forward for development for affordable housing, both in rural and in urban areas. And this research concluded that we need significant reforms to this process in order to be able to provide affordable housing, affordable homes in places that people want to live in at prices they can afford. The overarching conclusion and recommendation of this research is that the market-led speculative model, which is led by the private sector, is simply not working in terms of delivering affordable homes, and that we need to see much more involvement and leadership from the public sector, particularly local authorities, in the provision of housing. Another piece of research that we published in January this year was looking at the relationship between land reform and taxation. Now, land and property taxes have the potential to help to achieve long-term outcomes for land reform, such as diversification of land ownership, town centre regeneration, supporting the agricultural sector, and a just transition to net zero. And the Scottish Government had asked us to provide advice on the potential role of tax and fiscal policies to support these wider land reform objectives, which could also then enable the wider economic recovery that we need after the pandemic. So we pulled together an advisory group that helped us lead on this work, and we published a report and recommendations to ministers back in January. The recommendations we made sort of fall into 2 categories. The first are around future options for more effectively taxing land values, and the second are around future reform options for supporting economic recovery and border land reform objectives. Now, a piece of work that has been really dominating a lot of our thinking and resources and meetings in the last few months has been the relationship between the changes needed to meet the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis, and what those changes mean for land ownership and land values. Because we know that responding to these twin crises will require us to make significant changes in land use. We're going to see increased woodland regeneration, peatland restoration. We need better soil and carbon management. There are choices to be made around green infrastructure. There are huge opportunities here for Scotland, but there's also very significant risks, because it's essential that as these changes happen, they are done in a way which ensures that local communities and local economies are able to benefit from these changes and are not being asked to pay an unfair burden of the costs. In short, that this transition is just. And how we can do this is what we've been really focusing on. So we've got 3 pieces of work we're doing on this area. We've just published some research which analysed the actual land, the actual transitions, land sales in rural areas over the last couple of years to try and understand what's known as the green layered market effect, what effect this is actually happening in rural locations in terms of changing land values and who's buying land and for what purposes. The second area is that we've been working with the Scottish Government and other stakeholders to define what responsible investment in Scotland's land market should look like, and how it can be aligned with the principles of the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. And then the third area we're looking at is undertaking more research and providing advice on how communities can benefit from the carbon and natural capital markets. So before I finish, I should just tell you about the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, Dr. Bob McIntosh, who has got a role to improve relations between landowners and tenant farmers. So Bob and the team have been publishing a series of codes of practice, and they spend a lot of time responding to alleged breaches of those codes and also working with tenant farmers and landowners to implement those codes on the ground. They do a lot of work helping to promote mediation as a means of improving relations rather than taking legal action, which can be very timely and costly. And they've also been doing a lot of work supporting new entrants, particularly young folk who want to get involved in the agricultural sector. We co-launched the land matching service with the Scottish Government and the Farm Advisory Service back in 2018, I think. And we've also been doing a lot of work on succession planning. Now, before I finish, I just want to tell you about a new campaign and information hub, which we've set up called My Land Scotland. This information hub has a whole lot of different case studies, examples, and podcasts and other information and videos about the way in which individuals and organisations have changed the land around them and as a result have transformed their communities. We wanted to do this to get away from the idea that land reform is kind of really geeky or very technical, and just demonstrate what a transformative impact it's having for different communities across Scotland. So come and join the conversation, come and share your stories and get some inspiration for what you could do maybe more in your area. One of the most exciting parts of the My Land campaign is the Lay of the Land podcast, which is hosted by Callum McLean. And he's had a whole range of different really interesting conversations. Some of the more recent ones have been with Darren McGarvey and Naveed Bakash from Boots and Beards, which is a Glasgow-based walking group which celebrates diversity and the benefits of getting out into nature and outdoors for health and well-being purposes. So I'm going to hand back now to Andrew, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of this discussion. Thanks.
Megan, thank you very much indeed. So that was a gallop necessarily through what we do. And we do a lot of things with we are a very small organisation. We're a national organisation, so inevitably some of what we do will not be relevant to Shetland, but I think a lot of that was relevant to Shetland actually. Housing, clearly, well aware of the housing challenges on Shetland. The vacant and derelict land one is interesting, and John's post is asking where the sites are. I'll come to that in a second. Community empowerment, well aware of the toing and froing between the community and the ownership of the church and the Church of Scotland, where in fact I think, Emma, we advised a wee bit on that at one stage. Not sure that scale and concentration is such a big issue in Shetland, but carbon sequestration almost certainly will. So there's quite a lot of different things in there, some of which will be relevant and some will not. There will be some things that are highly relevant to you, but where we're not the advisory body. So for example, on crofting issues, more than happy to talk about crofting. It's hugely important and actually a very interesting and very early example of quite effective land reform in Scotland. So very happy to talk about that, but the primary advisor to government is the Crofting Commission. And similarly on things like nature and recreation, outdoor access, that sort of stuff, happy to talk about that. And in fact, I've got a question emailed to me about it, so I'll pick it up. But the main advisory body on that is SNH, or they're now called Nature Scot. So difficult background. So I'm looking to see who would like to contribute. And while I'm looking, I'm going to pick up John's question, which is a straightforward question, which is, Megan, the 8 sites that you referred to, presumably that's from the vacant and derelict legend.
Yes,
register.
I've just been trying to dig it out and I've got them here. So the Scottish Vacant and Derelict Land Survey is a national level register. You can Google it and find it on the Scottish Government's website and download it. The 8 sites in Shetland, there's 3 in Lerwick, Lower Black Hill, the Marts and Ness of Sound. There's one on Unts, there's one on Skeld, Midcame and Toft and Mossbank. And there's a whole range of different types of owners. It tells you who the owner is and what the status of the site is, how large it is and things like that. So I don't know if those sound familiar to you, John, but that's the information on the register.
Brilliant, thanks, Megan. So we'll try and get you a link to that, John. Megan, I don't know if you're able to post a link. If not, maybe Posey could try and find one. We'll do what we can, John. If not, if we fail, if the technology fails us, we'll find a way of getting it to you by email or something. John, thanks for that. And I should add that there is partly as a result of work we did a couple of years ago, a substantial fund available at the moment for bringing these sites, these derelict sites, back into productive use, including but not exclusively community-owned or community-led use. So there are some great examples actually. So I'm going to come to Emma and Matthew. I'll come to your point in a second, but I want to come to Emma. Emma, do you want to chip in? Go for it.
Thanks. I just wanted to draw people's attention to a route map that we have on the website, and it's about vacant and derelict land, and it helps people to, you can work through it, and it helps you to do things like identify owners and think about where you could get funding, and just how to tackle these sites, whether it's you as a community who want to do something about it, or if it's that you want the existing owner to do something about it, or maybe you want to work with the existing owner. Any of those kind of options are available to people, and the route map just sort of takes you through different options and where to get different bits of information. I'll ask Posey to pop that link up on the website for us. Thanks.
Brilliant. And Megan's put the link up to the register, so thanks, Megan. But Emma, before you run away, I wonder, just to help people sort of envisage what we're talking about, can you just give a couple of examples of where people have done sort of interesting things recently with derelict land, but preferably using some of this fund that I was talking about?
There's lots of examples really where communities have taken a vacant building and done something with it, and often that can mean some substantive renovations. So for example, Bridgend Farmhouse I visited recently in Edinburgh, and that's a really wonderful project where in the heart of the community they have a cafe, and they have workspaces, and they have allotments, and the project is, I just think it's smashing because it really demonstrates the power of working together. So for example, at that project, there is a cycle company called We Pedal, and they're a social enterprise, and they have a storage unit on the site. And I think it's rent-free. And in exchange for that, they provide free cycle training for children and adults who live in the local area. So a real kind of a good exchange where the company gets something it needs and Bridgend Farmhouse gets something it needs. But that was a really derelict site when the community took it over, and it had been transferred into the council's ownership. And eventually the community bought it off the council and did the renovations themselves. Now, a lot of work, but a lot of fantastic benefits have come out of it. And I was really pleased to talk to some of the volunteers who are still involved, just about everything that they've got from that. So that's one really, really nice example that I like, not in such a rural area, of course. I'll have a think if there's a good case study I can signpost to.
Great, thanks, Emma. I mean, there are good case studies around. So yeah, if we can find links, we'll put them up now. But there is actually a huge amount going on to try and bring vacant and derelict land back into use. And it matters, not just in itself, it matters because having a chunk of vacant and derelict land on your doorstep is just, it pulls down communities, it's negative, and it isn't just an urban issue at all. There are actually just very near where I live, there's an old derelict building, and it's a blight on the village, frankly, and I would love to see something done with it. Great. Now I want to just pick up Matthew's point. Matthew makes a point in the chat. Incidentally, please, if you'd like to speak, use the hand chat thing, but sorry, the hand raise thing. But meantime, I'll follow the chat. So Matthew, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of these issues are definitely very relevant to Shetland, and you know, I think it'd be very foolish to think otherwise. And as I said earlier, I particularly think that the issue of land use for carbon sequestration is going to be a big issue in places like Shetland, because you have peatland, peat moor, that has the capacity to sequester carbon, and therefore potentially, as that becomes something that you can sell, it becomes much more important. Is there less interest in Shetland? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. I think everywhere in Scotland there are people who are passionate about land reform, and everywhere in Scotland there are people who are not. I can't say that I pick up a big distinction. I think where you have crofting tenure, like the Western Isles or Shetland and so on, where you have a crofting tenure that is quite widely distributed. In some respects, that very early attempt at land reform has been quite effective. It has distributed land and it has dealt with some of the issues that afflict Scotland, but it hasn't dealt with things like land for housing. You go to Shetland and, a young person trying to buy a house in Shetland, God help them. And, just as it is in Applecross where Megan stays or anywhere else. So many of these issues are common and exercise people. But I guess you've made that point, Matthew, because you think it is less of an issue in Shetland. I don't know. Let's hear from others. And please, if you'd like to speak, it'd be lovely to hear some voices. I'm looking for this hand thing. While I'm waiting, or while I'm letting you think about that, I want to pick up a question from Jane Johnston, or a comment from Jane Johnston. She's not here, at least she is. She wasn't when I quickly checked earlier. I think she said she probably couldn't make it. She wanted to know about access and access rights. So as I explained, the government's advisor on that is Nature Scott, not ourselves. But I think it is worth some thought on this, because it is clearly an important issue in itself, but it's also an important issue because in many ways it exemplifies what I think we're trying to do in Scotland, which is to move to a situation where people who have land rights also have responsibilities. Now, clearly, if you own land, you have land rights, and therefore, clearly, you have responsibilities. But if you have access rights, those are also land rights. And if you have access rights, then you also have responsibilities. And Jane's point is that some people seem to think that access rights come without responsibilities, and you can romp about the place and let your dog charge all over the place and leave gates open or whatever else. And quite clearly that is not responsible exercise of a right. So I'm absolutely with Jane on that. In terms of what we do about that specific issue, I'm not that close to Shetland to comment in detail. The primary responsibility for dealing with this, for access on Shetland, rests with Shetland Council, and of course, where someone is behaving illegally, it rests with the police. So that is how we deal with it. There is a suggestion in Jane's email that, would it be appropriate to modify access rights? I think we have to be careful of that one. The notion of sort of collective punishment reminds me of my school days when someone scribbled on the blackboard during break time, we all got kept in. Just because one person is behaving irresponsibly doesn't, I think we'd struggle to as a society to agree that because someone down the road is behaving irresponsibly, therefore we all get punished. That one I think is a struggle, and actually I think a farmer would recognise that, because clearly if one farmer is, for example, one farmer is irresponsible in the way they look after their sheep, that doesn't mean to say that all farmers get banned from keeping sheep. It just doesn't work. So I think what we have to do is deal with the irresponsible people. And Emma, I think it might be just helpful to extend this a bit, because we've done a lot of work on this whole concept of rights and responsibilities. And I wonder if you could say a wee bit more about that, please.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So Megan mentioned the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, which is the Scottish Government and various stakeholders who inputted into it. It's their explanation of what our rights and responsibilities are. And it's really helpful in giving people a definition of what responsible land ownership would look like, for example. The Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement is quite high level, and it has 6 principles in it. One is about human rights, one is about community ownership, one is community engagement and collaboration. There's one on good stewardship, so long-term care for land, and there is one about transparency of ownership, so being transparent and clear about who owns land and how decisions are made. And the final one is about diversifying land ownership, so addressing the concentration of ownership in Scotland. Underneath the statement, the Commission, me and my team have published a suite of protocols, And they look at each of those principles and they give you more detail on how to do it actually in practice. Now, most of the responsibilities in these circumstances are put on landowners. So that's about landowners engaging positively with communities, for example. But there are also some expectations in there for how communities should also be behaving. So engaging positively with landowners, for example. So we're really keen, to kind of encourage that open and honest conversation where we can. And I'm starting to touch a little bit on Lisa's question, which I'm sure Andrew will bring us to next. So the land rights and responsibility statement and the protocols are voluntary. You don't have to follow them, but we are starting to embed them in policy and conditionality of grants and funding and licenses and that kind of thing. So you might not have heard of them, but you might actually have felt their impact in some way, shape or form. And we also work with landowners all across Scotland and all types, public, private, community, environmental NGOs, faith organisations and so on, to help them understand how to do it in practice. People in communities sometimes come to us because they're not happy about how a landowner is behaving or a land manager. And in that case, we're happy to go and have a conversation with the landowner or manager. And we quite often manage to help people make some progress. Again, it's about good communication and it's about helping to broker that relationship. But you'd be very welcome to contact me. I'll pop my email address in the chat in a moment if there's anything specific that you would want to raise, and I could help you identify where maybe that's a landowner not fulfilling their responsibilities or how the community can work better with the landowner or vice versa. Anything along those lines, we're very happy to advise on. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Emma. Lisa, I'll just come to the second part of your question in 2 seconds. Just Irvin, you've put up most of the land on the register for Shetland or council development land or farmland. I assume you're talking about the vacant derelict register. I don't think there's farmland on the vacant and derelict register unless it's ex-industrial land that's now being grazed. It is highly likely. Irvin, thank you. Yes, come in, please.
If you look at what's listed here, the Nessa Sound is owned by the council. That is a farm, and then there's some land that is not farmland there that's designated development ground. The Barts obviously is owned by the council, and the areas around it is also development. I think almost everything that's there is council owned with long-term development plans.
Great. Okay. Well, that's really helpful to have that. It's pretty normal for a lot of vacant and derelict land to be owned by local authorities because they often end up stepping into these situations. If it's on the register, it's on the register because Shetland Island Council have declared it vacant and derelict. I don't know enough about the background to why they've declared it vacant and derelict. But they, if they've got a specific development plan for a piece of land, then it's not vacant and derelict. So there's a curious contradiction in there. But
the Tough Camp was originally there for the oil industry, and then when that camp was disposed of, then parts of that was sold off and parts of it was kept. Great.
Okay. Well, look. I mean, if anyone is interested in pursuing any of those vacant derelict sites, the register exists to tell you where they are, who owns it, and therefore enables you to progress it. I don't think any of us have enough detailed knowledge of Shetland to go further than that, but I'm going to just come to Emma, who's got her hand up. Emma.
Hi, Andrew. Just you mentioned the vacant and derelict land investment programme earlier, and I didn't pick up on it. It's funding which has to be applied for by local authorities in partnership with communities. So if there are areas of land that you have a concern about, then it would be worth getting in touch with the council and just mentioning the fund to them. I can't remember exactly where it is in its cycle at the moment, but it'll be coming around again anyway, because it's a large fund and it's in place for a few years.
Thanks, Emma. It is a big fund. It's £50 million, which to my mind is a lot of money. Hilary, I see your hand up. So actually, could I just deal with Lisa's second point and then I'll come to Hilary. Lisa, so this question So if landowners you know, just basically give us two fingers, what powers do we have? And lots of people ask us that. I have to say, and I'll come to Emma in a minute, but I have to say my own experience is that landowners don't give us two fingers. They're actually pretty keen. I mean, of course, every walk of life has a few pain in the backsides in it, but you know, 95% of people are good people, and landowners are people like anybody else. So my experience is actually that they are very keen to engage, and very keen particularly to engage in the guides and the protocols and all the rest of it that we've put in place. We have done quite a lot of thinking about this. I chaired the review that led to the creation of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and the Tenant Farming Commissioner has, in law, powers to put in place codes of practice, and then in law, the right to investigate alleged breaches and name and shame and call for evidence and all the rest of it. And that has proved very powerful, actually. A lot of the behaviours that were occurring in the tenant farming sector prior to 2000, well, certainly which we uncovered in 2014 when we did the review, are not happening now. So there's no question that some powers are helpful. Whether that would translate onto the sorts of things that Emma and her team are doing, it is open for discussion, but I certainly think there's a sensible discussion to be had there. But Emma, we just a word on Lisa's point and your experience at the coalface, so to speak.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for the question. For the most part, we do find that private landowners engage with us quite positively. They often have realised that there's a challenge themselves, actually, but aren't quite sure what to do about it. So us approaching them is welcomed. We occasionally, and it really is occasionally, get no response and find it very difficult, but we're quite dogmatic and persistent in trying to find different ways to reach people. And for the most part, yeah, people do respond positively, or at least have the conversation with us, and with a number of occasions we've managed to make some really good progress with people, and that's ongoing. You know, we have ongoing relationships with lots of landowners. Yeah, again, do get in touch if there's anything specific that you want to talk about, maybe more privately than here.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Although we don't yet know what's in the consultation on the new land reform bill, it is possible, I suspect, that there'll be questions around this, and so keep a lookout for that. I'm expecting that consultation to come in, I think, early July, probably July. So keep a lookout for that. Now, Hilary, thank you for your patience, and thank you for putting your hand up. It's wonderful to hear real people. Over to you.
Hilary, you'll need to unmute if you want to speak, just checking. You should have a little sort of microphone button down the bottom of your screen which says mute underneath it. You'll need to click that.
Well, look, well, it's possible that Hilary's got distracted by something else, because I've taken so long to come to her, and I apologize if that's what's happened. Hilary, if you're trying to speak and it's not working, you better type into the chat and we'll try and figure something out. In the meantime, I'm going to go to Mary McClelland's point, which actually I think it opens a really interesting area of discussion. Because it's not just Shetland that's going to struggle to get to net zero. I think the whole world is going to struggle to get to net zero. But Scotland, you know, we're actually very lucky in a way, in a funny sort of way. We have an awful lot of land where it is possible to, through different types of management, to sequester more carbon. And actually, a lot of people are already pouring into the land market and buying land in Scotland because they see that selling offsetting capacity, i.e. taking, you know, fixing some sequestering carbon so that people can then offset that against their emissions. A lot of people are investing. Land prices, particularly certain types of land, are going up very fast. And that's potentially a bad thing. But it's potentially a very good thing. If loads and loads of people want to invest a heap of money in Scotland, well, let's not sneeze at that. the risk is that Scotland attracts a lot of investment, but actually the people of Scotland and the ordinary communities of rural Scotland don't get much benefit out of it. So this is not just about can we sequester carbon, it is also about can we sequester carbon in a way that benefits local communities, particularly rural local communities close to these sites. And that's a big, I think, a big challenge for us. Now, we're about to publish a piece of work on that with some recommendations, and we're just crystallizing the last bits of that. So forgive us if we're a wee bit vague. But Megan, why don't I just ask you to offer some thoughts on this, and then I might ask you to do the same, Emma, because it's a big, complicated issue.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, it's a big, complicated issue, and it's something which is getting a lot of attention at the moment. The much as I don't like the term green layers, it certainly kind of captures everyone's imagination in the headlines. So yes, in terms, Mary, of your question about where you can learn from other areas that are rich in peatland, probably the best starting point in terms of understanding what's happening in terms of actual peatland code projects and peatland projects and restoration projects would be the Peatland Action Project of NatureScot, and I can put a link up to that in a minute, because Peatland Action are the ones who are actually helping to sort of arrange the different agreements around peatland restoration projects, and they've got a lot of projects going on across the Highlands and the Western Isles that may well be of relevance to you. But I think, as Andrew said, it is a really complicated area, and I think this isn't the first time that Scotland's had a big boom in sort of related to our natural resource assets, and previous booms haven't necessarily led to communities being able to share the benefits equitably, and that's why we're very keen this time around to make sure that we're putting the thinking about benefit sharing at the very forefront of the work as it's developed. And we've had a very clear message from the government and from Minister Mary McCallum that that's something that she's very concerned about, but it is still very much something that needs to be discussed. You only have to look at the way in which the fact that the benefit sharing mechanisms for onshore wind are simply done through guidance at the moment. It's not a regulatory requirement, and the community benefit sharing agreements that are done through hydropower, renewable, water-based hydropower energy generation, I can't talk, are also not, there's very much, it's a bit of a lottery as to whether or not there's community benefit payments given to communities there as well. So I think as Andrew said, this is something that we're doing research on. Other organisations like HIE are also doing some research on this. So over the next few months, there's going to be a lot more knowledge actually in terms of published papers, which will help provide a bit of a route map to this. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that there's a clear difference between the type of benefit sharing agreements that a privately owned project would be able to reach with a local community in comparison to the way in which community-owned projects are able to deliver benefit sharing agreements. And there was some very interesting research done by published by Community Land Scotland, I think last year, which analysed some of the examples of where community-owned projects are delivering climate change projects, and the multiple different benefits that can be delivered from that. So I think we also need to be clear about the different tiers of benefits that can be reached, depends on who owns and controls the project. Emma, would you like to add anything to this?
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, a couple of things. So you may already know that there is funding to help with peatland restoration. So there is government money through the Peatland Action Fund that Megan mentioned, and there is private money comes in if you get your peatland restoration accredited through the Peatland Code. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are really important to mention about this. So where communities are able to own that land, they can also access that funding to help them to restore their peatland, but also to bring other benefits about through the work that they're doing. But there's also another way, which I think is going to be really interesting and has started to happen elsewhere in Scotland, And that's where we bring together communities with private organisations or environmental NGOs, and we get a partnership going. And that brings together, that builds in the community benefit, it empowers the communities, and it also brings in different kinds of expertise and money into the partnership as well. So that's something that I'm really kind of keen to explore. We'll be publishing a protocol on natural capital and carbon sequestration in the next few weeks, which will start to lay out what we think are the responsibilities of the people involved in those kind of partnerships and landowners in terms of taking forward these projects and how they can make sure that they're not disadvantaging people. So I'm thinking about tenants perhaps, or other people who might be impacted by the work that's taking place, and how they can actively build in benefits instead. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Shetland actually has a lot of quite interesting experience from way in which it's tried to develop wind power, in that it's one of the very few places where the public sector has taken quite a lead in developing wind power. So there's some interesting things happening in Shetland, which I have been following quite closely, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in relation to peatland. So thanks, Mari, for that. Really helpful. Irvin, you've got your hand up. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, it was just a quick question for Emma, really. When you've got private funding coming in, or businesses or organisations out with the land ownership or tenancy wanting to get involved in planting trees or peatland restoration, how does the carbon offset get divvied up for that? Because we've been approached by people who want to plant trees, etc., but they expect the carbon offset to go with them rather than the landowner or the tenant.
So there isn't a set way. It's up to you and the contract that you arrange, basically, to set that out. And I would definitely urge caution in how you go about it. I'd be happy to have a more detailed chat with you, and maybe signpost you to a couple of other people that might be good for you to have a chat with as well, because what we don't know is to what extent landowners are going to be expected to demonstrate carbon offsetting for themselves in the future. So if you sell it all, you can't use it for yourself. But there are also, some good ways and some good examples of partnerships coming together, which I think are mutually beneficial. So yes, watch out for some case studies that we'll be publishing. And if you send your email address to me, or just email me, I'll put my email address up, then I'll send some other stuff through to you, Irvin, as I come across it as well.
All right, thank you.
Irvin, thanks for raising that. We have actually, I'm just going to underline what Emma's just said. We have been advising farmers, crofters, landowners, communities to just take a wee bit of time over this. There are there's big money chasing this. There may well be significant amounts of money to be made out of all of this. There are, as always happens when there's money, there are also sharks swimming in the pond. And we know that, for example, common grazing's clerks have been approached by people offering contracts and all the rest of it. Landowners have been approached similarly. So just underline the point, take a bit of advice. Don't take the first person who comes knocking on your door with a juicy contract. It might not be so straightforward. Good. Thanks, Emma, for that word of caution. That is really helpful. Hilary, I noticed you just came back into the meeting. I don't know if you want to, you had your hand up before, whether you're wanting to contribute, but please stick your hand up if you want. Oh, I think actually she's gone again. Oh dear. Right, never mind. I saw Hilary come back in, but she's now dropped out. So I'm talking to thin air. Sorry. Okay, let's move on. Other thoughts that people, I'm struck by the fact that no one's talked about land for housing, because I'm perfectly well aware of the challenges of housing on Shetland, which are not all about land, of course. But so any observations on that would be helpful. We have done quite a lot of work on land for housing, but it's good. It's always helpful to get, feedback from people on the ground. And actually, if you've read our advice on land for housing, it'd be interesting to know what you thought of it as well. So that was an area I was quite keen to hear more on. And I'm also aware community ownership is gets a lot of press, and it's been hugely successful in some respects. Community ownership of land, community ownership of buildings, it's changing. We've been suggesting that we need to think more imaginatively about community ownership and think about sort of hybrid ownership models where there may be 2, 3, 4, 5 different owners owning sort of different bits of the rights. If anyone wants to contribute on any of those issues, that would be super. Katrina, yes, I'm sorry, I did say, well, I said I would go until 8:30 if people want to, but if not, then that's fine. Any further thoughts? Particularly, I should. There's Hilary now. Hilary, can you unmute yourself and ask, make your offer us your thoughts, please. Oops, you did unmute yourself and then it's gone back off again.
Can you hear me? Oh, hooray, thank goodness.
Hey, brilliant.
I'm so sorry about that. Somebody came to the door about something quite urgent, so I had to go and deal with it, but I'm back again now.
Brilliant.
Thanks for a very interesting discussion. I've maybe missed some of it, but I wondered, have you spoken about food security at all?
No, we haven't, and it is a hugely important issue, actually brought to the fore by what's happening in Ukraine, interestingly. So maybe, well, I'll offer some thoughts, and maybe, I don't know, Emma, I know you sort of think about these things, but it's a really interesting time because we've got a lot of investment in land. We're seeing land prices rocketing for carbon sequestration, for either on peatland or actually more commonly on the mainland for planting trees. And we've got real conflict actually between food production and some of these other uses, particularly conflict between food production and tree production. But of course, that's also partly a conflict between food production and carbon sequestration. And a lot of thought going into, so how do we do both? How do we produce food and do all these other things? Now, we're not the government's main advisor on food production or agriculture or anything else, so you'll have to forgive us if our thoughts are a bit superficial, but they absolutely relate to some of these big issues that we're talking about. Emma, do you want to chip in on this subject?
Sure. I think we have all these different uses for our land, all these competing different uses for our land. And it's really important that we try and get the right pattern of that. So one of the things that we've recommended through our protocols, for example, is that prime agricultural land isn't used for planting trees on or building houses on and so on, so that we protect that kind of national resource. And that will come through again in the natural capital and carbon sequestration protocol, just really urging caution about how we make that land use change. Was there something specific, Hilary, that you wanted to ask about it?
Well, it was a comment, really, I suppose, in that Shetland farmers and crofters, it's a difficult place to farm, and they work really hard to produce a quality product and quality food, whilst at the same time producing the environment where, for example, wading birds, they seem rare in other places, are common here. But when you're speaking about land use and future land use policy, it's a little bit disheartening not to feel that that's not being recognised. That was my point, really.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure that's the case. One of the things that I am expecting is that where we've got the peatland code and the woodland carbon code, there should also be other codes coming online, like a soil code, for example, and that should bring some opportunities for people like yourselves, farmers and crofters, to tap into that additional source of funding. And of course, you'll be aware of the agricultural bill going through at the moment and being scrutinised. Megan, I can see you want to come in, so I'll just pass straight over to you.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, just to reassure you, Hilary, we often get asked about food on these meetings. So it's definitely is something that's on our agenda. It's just that when we talk about land and land reform, it can go off in so many different directions. It's hard. We try and stay focused, and you saw how much I struggled trying to keep to the 15-minute slot I have at the beginning in terms of going through the work. through the overall work. No, I mean, I just to support everything that Emma has said, but also just to say, I think there is definitely a conversation underway at the moment about how we put what is the best use of different parts of land across Scotland. We've got these various different competing objectives. You've given a really good example of how you try and produce food on a croft in a small holding on Shetland, but also produce benefits in terms of biodiversity and waders and birds and things like there is an agricultural bill coming up. There's the Good Food Nation bill, which has, I think, just reached has made another progression through Parliament just today. I haven't managed to exactly catch up on the details, but one of the things we've been very much pushing for is a more localized conversation about how we meet all these different tensions and uses for land. Last year we published some proposals around what we called regional land use partnerships, which are now being piloted by the government in terms of a framework for a regional level discussion, and that can be done at whatever, it's at the moment it's being piloted at the local authority level, but it can be done on a much smaller scale if that's the region at which it makes more sense to bring up all the key stakeholders together and have a conversation about how do you do land use planning and how do you think about what the best use of bits of land are in different places in order to try and meet all these different multiple objectives, and food security being really central to that. And then just again give a nod back to the issue of crofting, which Andrew mentioned at the beginning, that crofting and smallholder production is absolutely at the heart of that in terms of food production, which is also simultaneously reducing food miles and thinking about the most sustainable use of land in a particular area. So thanks for raising that, Hilary.
Hilary, thanks. I'm going to come to Evan in 2 seconds. I just want to add a tuppence worth from me, if you'll forgive me. Actually, I think, Hilary, people do recognise that in places like Shetland or the Western Isles, crofters do produce a damn good product. I mean, some of the lamb from Shetland is some of the best lamb I've ever eaten, and produce a really good natural heritage product, for want of a better term. The problem that we've had in this country for a long time is that our agricultural support mechanisms have not been sufficiently locally tailored to deal with the diversity of Scotland as a country. And the recommendations that we made on land use partnerships, which Megan referred to, part of that thinking is to, and it's going to be interesting to see how this works, but part of that thinking is, could we tailor agricultural support in a much more localized way to reflect these highly localized differences in Scotland, which I think is really at the guts of this. I think people know perfectly well, if they pause and think, that Shetland does a brilliant job on producing food and producing wildlife, but we don't at the moment have a locally tailored system to support it. So fingers crossed, we're heading in the right direction. Evan, I'm going to let you in. You've been very patient.
No problem at all. Thank you. I'll just like to echo what you said there. I mean, of my understanding that there's we could be quite close to a global food shortage, and one of the ways to prevent that is to have more small holdings. Big farms is the way that it seems to go for easiness, and that's how all the difficulties you have, that's how it goes. But I just wonder if it's part of the Land Commission's thoughts to try and reduce the amount of big farmers, industrial type farmers, and have a more diverse model like the small crofts and islands.
Evan, thanks very much. And so I think that's a really interesting question, and it's, in a sense, it's more than a question. It's a suggestion. It's an observation. And we've worked quite hard in the last year or two to examine the question: how do we diversify the ownership of land in Scotland? Scotland's got a very concentrated pattern of ownership. We've worked quite hard on that, but I don't think we've really. Well, I don't think. I mean, I know we haven't really drilled into the question of productivity of land, because on the one hand, economies of scale may give you an economically more productive model, but that doesn't mean it's more productive in terms of the amount of food it produces. It just means that it's more productive in the sense of economic inputs and outputs, which is a rather different thing. So I'm going to take that and stick it on the wall, Irvin, if you don't mind. We've got another 3-year plan to think about towards the end of this year. Food security, I think, is going to be on the agenda, not just on the back of Ukraine, although that's brought it to the fore. But my own belief is that the trends, the climate trends we're experiencing globally now are going to, well, some would argue that Ukraine is a consequence of climate change, actually, interestingly. But it seems to me highly likely that food security will be on the agenda for a long time to come because of climate change. So I'm going to stick that on the wall as a suggestion. Thanks, Irvin. And I don't know if either of the other two want to come in and violently disagree with me. Please do if you want. That's very nice, very decent of you. Thank you. Great. Anybody else want to come in? Nobody want to say anything about housing? I'm going to assume that you're all happy about housing then. No. Okay, well, look. Oh, Lawrence, a new person wants to speak. Wonderful. Lawrence, please come in, but unmute yourself first.
Hi, yeah, some about housing, maybe nothing to do with land commissions really, but there's lots of areas in Shetland now that the land has been sterilised for housing development due to the number of domestic turbines that have been built. Now, I've always supported the building of domestic turbines, and it appears to be that through planning, they can build them, and it doesn't matter if they're noisy for existing households, but when you put in a planning application for a house, you get turned down because there are too many wind turbines.
Thanks, Lawrence. I've followed the saga of the wind farm on Shetland for years, actually. It's been a long, difficult process. I'm very, very aware of that. So I sort of wander into this with trepidation, I have to admit.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't mean the big wind farm. I mean the small domestic ones.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you were talking about the big turbine.
Small domestic ones that are built quite near Craft House, and they're built in the community. And I mean, I see 4 or 5 from our house, and I was told that I wouldn't be able to downsize my house. I mean, I'm planning retirement, to see, downsize my house anywhere near me because I wouldn't get plan permission. And right. I mean, I'm from Borrow and Yale, and that's one area that's sort of totally sterilised for housing development because of existing wind turbines. And there's other areas in Shetland I know the same. But that's all. Well, I mean, it's really out with your role, I know.
No, but it's really interesting. Thank you. Actually, that's another one we're going to stick on the wall. That's really interesting. No, you're right, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, planning policy is a matter for Shetland Island Council. So I'm not going to tell Shetland Island Council what to do. They've got a democratic mandate. But it's a really interesting point. Megan, you've got your hand up, Megan.
Thank you. I mean, yes, the question of small domestic turbines is definitely not something that we're working on. But the broader question about whether or not the planning system is helping to facilitate houses in remote rural island communities is something that came up in one of the papers that was published as part of that wider package of research that I spoke about in terms of land and housing work. Because when we looked at the issue of land availability for housing in remote rural and island communities, what we found was that there was a whole range of reasons why affordable housing wasn't being delivered in communities that have a desperate housing needs. And one of the issues, there's issues around the availability of land, but also issues around problems of the planning system not being nuanced enough to really properly consider and cope with decisions around houses in areas which are you know, in remote rural and island communities where you know, the development needs are different from other parts of Scotland. So one of the recommendations we made in that report was around the need for sort of more nuanced planning decisions, whether that's to do with, you know, the impacts of domestic wind farms, or whether it's to do with development zones and the creation of sort of clusters of affordable housing within larger areas, and the sort of the population, the migration of population the migrations of people to urban areas within Highlands and Islands, such as Lerwick and Stornoway and Portree, and places which is sort of working against the government objectives around repopulation and things. So this is what you've touched on is part of a wider set of issues that we covered in that paper. And I hope that Posey will be able to put up the link to that paper, because there's some pretty interesting recommendations. But as Andrew said, at the end of the day, these are issues that the planning departments need to consider in terms of how they make balanced decisions about different development needs in different areas.
Lawrence, thanks for that. That is a really interesting point. And yes, I mean, we're not going to, it's not our job to advise on planning, and we shouldn't meddle in democratic matters, but we may be called upon to offer sort of wider advice about housing. We already have advised that, I'm sure it'll come up again. And actually, Irvin's point that he's just put up in the chat there is absolutely, you know, that's another challenge nationally now. Not just in the construction industry, but I mean, labour shortages across Scotland and indeed across the Western world are now a serious issue. The Bank of England published a report this morning flagging this as a serious constraint to the UK and Scottish economy. So there's no question that there are concerns. What we did was tried to say, look, where land availability is a constraint on housing, and it is in some places, you know, quite a lot of places, where land availability is a constraint, here's some things that you can do. And we've published advice for government, and that advice has been taken very seriously. Posey's put the recommendations up there. And yes, the point that Lisa's put up is, so in Shetland, getting labour onto the island is difficult because there's nowhere to live. Where Megan lives, it's extremely difficult for people to come in to work, or indeed people who live there to stay and work, because so many houses are second homes. So there are big challenges in Scotland around housing, in rural Scotland, I beg your pardon, around housing. And there are big challenges in urban Scotland too. You know, it is, you know, there's a very interesting graph, which unfortunately I don't have to hand, but if you look at the cost of buying a house over the last 30 or 40 years, and you graph it, what you'll see is that the building cost has broadly followed inflation, but the cost of buying the piece of land underneath it to build on has vastly exceeded inflation. And that tells you that there is something wrong with the land supply. That it is land supply that is the issue, not the actual cost of buying bricks and cement and windows and all that sort of stuff. So that was the issue that we addressed. Not easy. And yes, it's a catch-22, Irvin. Thank you. Great. Big issue. I suspect we'll be returning to housing in future years. It's become such a problem for our country in lots of different ways, and it worries the hell out of lots of people. I mean, I'm old enough to be lucky enough to have been able to buy a house, but my children can't afford to buy a house, and that's a nightmare. What are they going to do? My daughter's cleared off and gone overseas. It's not good for this country. Sorry, that was a wee personal note, but there's no harm in that. Okay, just 10 minutes or so left. Any last thoughts that anyone wants to offer? Very grateful for anything you know, feel free to challenge us. We're public servants. We're here to be held to account. So tell us if you've all been very polite, but please tell us if you think we're doing things that are a waste of time. Happy to hear that too. No? Oh well, that's good. Okay, well look, I think we'll wrap it up. One thing I'd like to say though before I close is this: if this meeting was taking place in a village hall, what I would say now is thank you all very much for coming. I'll stay behind in case you want to speak to me privately. And quite a lot of people would then stay behind and speak to me privately because they want to say things and they don't want to say it in front of other people. And it's always, that is always the case. So yeah, so I don't know what's happened to the, oh yeah. So there's an email, there we are, it's come up now, thank you. So on the screen now, you should see a phone number and an email address. And if you can't see it, just Google Land Commission Scotland and you'll find it. But if you would like to speak to me or Megan or anybody else, Emma, any other particular person, the Tenant Farming Commissioner or whatever, please email and we will phone you and you can speak to us privately. I think it's important that members of the public can speak privately to the chairman or anybody else in authority in these organizations. So if you want to do that, please do so. And I can tell you that people do so. And it is often because they're frightened of speaking in front of their landowner or whatever it is. And so please take advantage of that if you wish to, and I will promise to phone you back. Also on the screen in front of you is a funny square thing that's called a QR code if you're technologically illiterate like me, and if you point your phone at it or the camera on your phone, it should take you to a survey. Now don't worry if you can't, there are other ways of getting at the survey. It'll be, you can email us or it'll be emailed to you, but there'll be well, I think there's a link actually. Yes, here, there's the email address coming up on the chat. But if you can use the QR code, please use it. But whether you can or not, you use the link or whatever. But feedback would be really helpful. We would really value what did you think of that? Was it useful? And was it, was the format right? Did we miss things? So please tell us, please give us feedback. And please feel free to tell us, offer us feedback on what we're doing. Tell us, are we hitting the right priorities? It's difficult when we're trying to do things that are a priority for, Scotland, and Scotland is such a diverse place. It's difficult. So please tell us what you think. Shetland is different from other bits of Scotland, and we need to understand what your priorities are. So thank you all very much indeed. Actually, lots of things came in there, and I'm most grateful for that. We'll cogitate on all that, and it will, as I said before, all these things inform our thinking, inform our forward planning and all the rest of it. So I'm most grateful. So safe journey to your kettle or your drinks cupboard or wherever you're off to now. And thank you all very much indeed for that. I'm most grateful. Good night to you all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.